Who in their right mind would put a tortoise badge on the front of a 140 mile per hour Grand Touring car? Not a lion, not a stallion, a tortoise. Well, two men in their quest to build the ultimate 1960s GT car would end up doing just that. One was a racing engineer, the other a car builder, and together they fused Italian design, American muscle, and British ingenuity into their crowning achievement. It was styled by a young Giugiaro, powered by a Corvette V8, and assembled by a company that almost no one had ever heard of. But that didn't stop it from being one of the most interesting cars to come out of the British countryside that decade, and it even put Aston Martin on notice for at least a moment. It was the Gordon Keeble. The story of the Gordon Keeble all started not in a glamorous design studio, but in a workshop in Slough, hardly the beating heart of European automotive design. But it's where John Gordon, formerly of Peerless Cars, crossed paths with Jim Keeble, a racing engineer with a taste for performance. Gordon had helped bring the Peerless GT to life. It was a handsome British coupe with a tubular chassis, Triumph running gear, and a lightweight fiberglass body. It was a sports car that predated the Gordon Keeble, and it even ran at Le Mans in 1958. They managed to sell just about 300 of these cars, which was impressive for a small independent brand, but persistent build issues and the financial strain of running a car company meant that the Peerless dream faded early. However, this experience gave Gordon somewhat of an edge when it came to bootstrapping a car company, which he would then do again. Coincidentally, before the doors fully closed at Peerless Cars, a unique request landed in the group's lap. An American fighter pilot stationed in the UK asked if they could take one of the existing Peerless GT chassis, throw out the Triumph running gear, and fit it with a V8. The Peerless GT, weighing in at just 2,400 pounds or so, would make a lethal chassis for a V8 to be fitted to, and the project intrigued both Keeble and Gordon. Keeble handled the engineering, Gordon managed the build, and what rolled out of the garage was a one-off called the Gordon GT. The Gordon GT was rough around the edges, but it worked and it was fast. Encouraged by the result, Gordon and Keeble decided to do what so many brave or foolish men had done before. They were going to start a new car company from the ruins of Peerless. Now, it would have been easier to build fiberglass kit bodies to fit on a Corvette, but they wanted to build full-on production cars, ones that would hold a candle to the likes of Jaguar and Aston Martin. And so they needed a design that could awe crowds with the best of them. So they took their prototype to the one place where style was effectively currency, and that was Italy, specifically Bertone. And there, a young designer named Giorgetto Giugiaro, who would later become one of the most influential car designers in history, was handed the task. And what he came up with was nothing short of stunning. The design was long, low, and clean. It featured these unique slanted quad headlights that had these muscular front fenders kind of draped over them, and the side profile, that silhouette was very Italian, way more Turin than it was Thames Valley. Sure, it wasn't exactly Maserati or Ferrari pretty, because those slanted headlights did make it look kind of angry all the time rather than classically beautiful, but proportionally it was pretty spot on. Back in Britain, Keeble got to work designing a chassis that could live up to the elegance of Giugiaro's design and survive the abuse of a torquey American V8. Their chassis design wasn't a totally fresh one. What it ended up being was really the culmination of everything that they had learned prior from the Peerless GT. The Peerless GT's chassis was simple in nature and could respond well to some much-needed re-engineering. It was a standard space frame chassis where the fiberglass body bolted on top of it. Realistically, it was a blank canvas. So when it came time to build the Gordon Keeble, Gordon and Keeble simply took that Peerless GT blueprint, re-engineered it for their use case, and just turned every dial up a notch. The suspension up front had double wishbones with coil springs and telescopic dampers to give it solid up front feel and composure. With the rear end, they switched the live axle that would have came on the Peerless GT and swapped it in favor of a Didion setup with a Watts link. It was clever, it was sophisticated compared to a standard live axle, and it gave the Gordon Keeble a lot better rear end stability. Braking on the car was similarly upmarket. It had four-wheel Dunlop disc brakes with a servo assist as standard. This was a pretty bold move when a lot of rivals still had drums in the rear, which meant that, by comparison, the Gordon-Keeble could actually stop really fast, like predictably stop from triple-digit speeds. Testers of the day even noted how the car stayed flat and composed under heavy braking, and it would need good brakes because of what was under the hood. That was this car's party piece. The 327 cubic inch small block Chevy V8, straight from the C2 Corvette, with 300 horsepower and 360 foot-pounds of torque on tap. With this under the hood and the relatively low curb weight, the Gordon-Keeble was properly quick. But it wasn't just those on-paper numbers, it was the character of the motor. The 327 wasn't a high-strung, peaky European engine. The 327 was still a high rever, don't get me wrong, but it did have the torque down low to still be punchy. It was also dead nuts reliable in an era when those high-performance Jags and Astons seemed to require constant fiddling to get it running right. That carbureted 327 was a nice bonus for those who wanted to spend more time driving their car than working on it. When it was all wrapped up, the Gordon-Keeble pretty much took everything that made the Peerless GT promising and just did it better, with better materials, better design, a better power plant, better suspension, and just overall more polish in the fit and finish. It was, in that sense, the car that Peerless probably would have wanted to build if they could. A proper Grand Tourer with world-class engineering beneath its beautiful Italian body. And with all this completed, in 1964, the first production cars of the Gordon-Keeble began to emerge from the factory for the world to enjoy. Priced at 2,798 Great British pounds, it was a bargain, especially when you consider that an Aston Martin DB5 cost about double that. For your money, you got Italian styling, American firepower, and British engineering all in one Grand Tourer. It was a proper four-seater too, with a big boot, a comfortable ride, and a cabin that didn't require yoga training to squeeze into. And the press, they loved it. Motoring journalists praised the Gordon-Keeble for its effortless performance, its cornering composure, and its ability to be a well-rounded GT car. But good reviews don't necessarily pay the bills. See, behind the scenes, the dream of the Gordon-Keeble was already starting to fray at the edges. Much like Peerless, this was again a tiny car company, with barely over 100 employees at its peak, and cash flow was tight from day one. But the thing that did them in came from the most unlikely place. It was the steering box supplier. Adwest, the company providing their steering gear, hit an industrial dispute and stopped deliveries. Without steering boxes, the cars couldn't get finished. And without finished cars, dealers couldn't get paid and cash couldn't get recycled back into the business. And without cash, the company stalled fast. The company launched in 1964. By 1965, Gordon-Keeble entered receivership. Production stopped, and a few months later, a new company, Keeble Cars Ltd., attempted to revive the project. A handful more cars were built, but the writing was already on the wall. By the summer of 1966, it was all over. Just about 99 or 100 cars had been built, depending on who you ask, with some of the final examples being assembled from leftover parts after the factory went dark. But the story didn't quite end there. In 1968, an American entrepreneur named John DeBruyne bought the rights to the Gordon-Keeble, hoping to revive the project across the Atlantic. Two rebadged cars, now wearing his name, were shown at that year's New York Auto Show, with one of these new cars they were displaying being a concept for a new mid-engined coupe. All of this was super ambitious, and no one really expected the Gordon-Keeble body style to live on. But like the original company, this didn't last either. In fact, no production cars came from this venture, and the Gordon-Keeble name quietly slipped back into obscurity. And yet, despite all that, this car never really died. Let me explain. Today, nearly like 90 of these original cars are apparently still accounted for, which for such a low production vehicle, for 90% of the cars to still be around is pretty impressive. But it makes sense. People were proud of their Gordon-Keebles when they bought them. They purchased this vehicle because it was a scrappy upstart, it was a very solid car, and it was just something different than an Aston or a Jag. And they kept them in good condition because they were unique and meant a lot to them. But for one brief moment in the 1960s, with the tortoise on the badge, the Gordon Keeble, with its V8 under the hood, made some of the biggest names in the British motoring world worried. And that concludes the short story of the Gordon Keeble. Hope you all enjoyed this video. I love making videos on oddball cars like these, so if you found this one as interesting as I did, please go ahead and leave a like and drop a comment below. It really helps me out. But otherwise, I will see you all in the next one, enthusiasts.